Hello, lovers of philosophy. Welcome to the 14th series of double causality from the logic of sense. This is the third chapter in a row to mention the fragility of the surface. The previous chapter took the point of view of the schizophrenic or the madman, speaking from within the depths of their bodies after the surface has collapsed, after there is no sense. This chapter takes us back to the surface. He says that the fragility of the surface is easily explained, and he'll go about talking about the organization of the surface to explain it. He'll say sense is always an effect, but it has two causes. One is corporeal, bodies, states of affairs, mixtures of bodies, qualities are one cause for sense or the event. However, to become autonomous from these bodies so that it exists on its own, it needs a second cause, an incorporeal cause, or a metaphysical cause. He calls that cause a quasi-cause. This quasi-cause is synonymous with what he earlier called the paradoxical element that circulates between the two series of language and things. Or it's the same as nonsense, which circulates, but he also says it can be the aleatory point. So this quasi-cause can be not just nonsense, it can be randomness, it can be chance. It can be uncertainty, but it needs this second cause to make sense completely autonomous from the body. So sense has two aspects. The first aspect is its striking impassibility to things or states of affairs, its impenetrability, its inefficacy, its sterility. And on the other side, to propositions, it's neutral in regards to propositions. For instance, you can say two propositions that contradict each other, such as God is or God is not, and those two propositions have the same sense. So sense doesn't have an active nature or a passive nature. The second aspect comes from its quasi-cause, which is that sense is produced. It doesn't have an originary aspect somewhere. It's produced by the quasi-cause. And these two aspects of sense, Deleuze says, create a problem because sense is what engenders the different dimensions of the proposition. It's what brings to life the signification of the proposition, the subject or the manifestation of the proposition, and the denotation of the proposition. Without sense, there's no meaning to the proposition. However, how can sense be produced in that regard when sense is sterile or impassible? This is the problem Deleuze states without giving it an obvious answer. I think he does give it an answer, but it's not obvious, and I'm not going to say what I think it is because I think it's better for people to discover that on their own. So for a quasi-cause, for this second aspect of what causes sense, the metaphysical cause, Deleuze needs a transcendental field. He'll say that the problem between how can sense engender the proposition when it's sterile is the difference between formal logic and transcendental logic. So for the transcendental logic, for the quasi-cause to be in operation, he needs a transcendental field, which he presents his own transcendental field of singularities in the next series, which I already covered. But the second half of this series on double causality is not so much about the double causality, but about he's setting up the groundwork for his transcendental field presentation. He starts that by criticizing phenomenology, Husserl, saying how that philosophy bestows sense. But he'll criticize it. He'll say what's lacking in it. He says it's beholden to good sense and common sense. And he's also looking for a transcendental field that's pre-individual, and that's a problem with phenomenology, according to Deleuze. In contrast to the impenetrability, impassibility, and neutrality of sense, as soon as sense is grasped in relation to its quasi-cause, which produces it and distributes it on the surface, it inherits, participates in, even envelops and possesses this ideational cause. This ideational cause is nothing without its effect. It haunts the effect. It has an immanent relation with the effect on the surface. So once it turns the product of the effect into something productive. So the ideational cause is very important for the autonomy of sense. So in spite of sense or the event gaining its autonomy with a relation to a quasi-cause, the fragility of the surface is still there. Passion words or action words can still come up and make the surface collapse, take away the sense. We can look as an example at the war in Ukraine, where prior to the Russian invasion, the surface in Ukraine was a normal operating country. And once these passion words, these action words, put all these forces into effect and the Russians invaded Ukraine, that surface collapsed. And in the next chapter, Deleuze will start off using the example of a battle to describe a big event. So that's one large example of the surface collapsing. I guess it becomes a different kind of surface, though. Another example, it doesn't have to be a madman or a schizophrenic. You can just look at someone who is having an upset, who is in the throes of anger or sadness or some other passion, and how they'll use passion words and action words to effectively collapse the surface, collapse their equilibrium, and they go down into the depths of their bodies. And from there, they're not operating at the surface anymore. So this is leading up to Deleuze's presentation of his transcendental field of singularities. And interestingly, he'll also call singularities anti-generalities in this section, which I think is a good clue for what he's talking about. He's talking about the differences over similarities. So singularities for him are anti-generalities. So I think the esoteric side of this chapter can be found in one way that Deleuze expresses the problem of how sense can be both impassible, sterile, impenetrable, or neutral in relation to the proposition, and yet how a sense must get produced and become productive in order to engender the different dimensions of the proposition. And this is how he sums up the problem in one way. At the heart of the logic of sense, one always returns to this problem, this immaculate conception being the passage from sterility to genesis. So I've already produced a video on the 15th series of singularities where Deleuze presents his transcendental field. So the next video will cover Series 16 of the static ontological genesis, how being comes into being. See you then.